The sound of a $3,500 monthly wire transfer leaving my account used to feel like a tribute to my sister's memory. Now, it feels like the steady drip of a leaking pipe in a house that's about to collapse. Over 30 months, I have sent $105,000 to my brother-in-law, Julian Vane. To afford it, I live in a studio apartment where the most expensive thing I own is a dual-monitor setup for my forensic accounting work. I eat meal-prepped lentils, I drive a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked tail light, and I haven't taken a vacation since my sister, Clara, was buried. Clara was the sun in our family's orbit. She was a lead architect who earned $140,000 a year, a woman who could design a skyscraper on a napkin and quote the building codes from memory. Julian was the moon, he only shone when her light was hitting him. He ran a branding agency that never seemed to have clients, but Clara loved him. When she died of a sudden pulmonary embolism at 36, the world didn't just stop, it inverted. At the funeral, Julian was a masterpiece of performative grief. He clung to their 7-year-old daughter, Maya, his eyes red-rimmed, whispering that he didn't know how they would survive without Clara's income. The mortgage, the private school, the life she wanted for Maya, it's all going to vanish, Elias, he told me, his voice breaking in a way that felt scientifically engineered to trigger my guilt. I didn't hesitate. I'm a forensic accountant, I know that grief is expensive, but I also know that numbers provide a floor when the world falls away. I told him I would cover the gap. $3,500 every month. I told myself it was for Maya. I told myself I was protecting the legacy of the woman who used to help me with my math homework. But last Tuesday, the floor gave way. I arrived at Julian's house, the modern glass and steel home Clara had designed herself, 2 hours early for my monthly visit with Maya. Julian wasn't there. His mother, Sylvia, let me in, looking startled, her hand fluttering to her throat like a trapped bird. Maya was in the kitchen, sitting at a table that cost more than my car, trying to glue the sole of her school shoe back onto the leather with a glue stick. Maya, honey, what are you doing? I asked, kneeling beside her. She looked at me with Clara's eyes, wide, intelligent, and far too old for a second grader. Daddy said we have to be careful with money, Uncle Elias. He said the family fund is low this month. I looked at her shoes. They were scuffed, the heels worn down to the plastic. I looked at the pantry, it was stocked with generic crackers and bulk pasta. This was a house that received $3,500 a month in pure, untaxed cash from me, on top of Clara's life insurance payout, which Julian had collected 2 years ago. Maya leaned in, her voice a ghost of a whisper that made my blood turn to ice. Uncle Elias, please don't be mad at Daddy. But can you check the blue folder in the garage? He told Grandma it's the New Life folder. He said we're going to move to a place where no one knows us soon. My heart didn't just beat, it thudded against my ribs like a hammer. A new life? He says the money you send is the seed, she whispered, her tiny fingers gripping my sleeve. He told Grandma that once the seed hits $120,000, we can leave. But he says I can't take my books. He says we have to start fresh. I drove home in a silence so thick I could hear the hum of the streetlights. I sat at my desk and pulled up my bank records. 30 months. $105,000. I had been eating lentils and working 80-hour weeks to fund a seed for a man who was planning to disappear with my niece. Julian thought he was playing a game of emotional leverage. He thought because I was the quiet brother, I wouldn't look past the grief. He forgot that my entire professional life is built on one core truth, the math never lies, and the paper trail always leads to the truth. I opened a new spreadsheet on my monitor. I didn't label it grief. I labeled it the Vane liquidation. The hum of my dual monitors was the only sound in my studio apartment as I began the digital autopsy of Julian Vane's life. As a forensic accountant, I've spent a decade chasing ghosts through offshore accounts and shell companies for corporate clients. I never imagined my most high-stakes investigation would be into the man who sat at my dinner table every Christmas. I started with the wire transfers. $3,500 leaving my account on the first of every month like clockwork. To Julian, these were gifts for Maya's survival. To me, they were now data points. I pulled the metadata from the recipient bank, a mid-tier local branch Julian had used for years. But when I looked closer at the routing, I noticed a bounce. Every transfer I sent was immediately swept into a secondary account within 4 hours of arrival. The secondary account wasn't in Julian's name. It belonged to an LLC registered in Delaware called Vane Designs. I leaned back, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. Julian had told the family he closed his branding agency after Clara died because he couldn't focus on work while grieving. In reality, he hadn't closed it, he'd rebranded it into a shell to catch my money. "You're not a grieving widower, Julian," I whispered to the screen. "You're an embezzler." The next morning, I used a professional subscription to an international property database. If Julian was building a seed to start a new life, he needed a destination. I ran his name and the Vane LLC through Caribbean property registries. The hit came back at 11 a.m. Vane Designs was the majority shareholder in a fix-and-flip luxury condo project in Grand Cayman. The buy-in was exactly $120,000. My stomach twisted into a knot of cold fury. I had been eating lentils and skipping car repairs to fund Julian's beachfront retirement. He wasn't struggling to pay Maya's tuition, he was waiting for my 35th payment to hit so he could reach that $120,000 milestone and disappear. I took a personal day from my firm and drove to Clara's old office. She had been a lead architect, and I knew her files were organized with the same precision I used for my audits. I spoke to her former partner, Sarah, who looked at me with sad eyes. "Elias, Julian came by 6 months ago to collect the rest of Clara's personal archives," Sarah told me, her voice low. "He said he was putting them in a safety deposit box for Maya. But he missed a small box in the back of the blueprint room." She handed me a slim, black portfolio. Inside were Clara's private sketches, not for clients, but for her own dreams. And tucked into the back was a manila folder labeled in her elegant, slanted script, "Financial contingency, private." I opened it in the front seat of my car, my hands shaking. Inside was a handwritten note dated just 4 months before her death. "Elias, if you are reading this, I hope it's because I'm old and retired, but my gut tells me Julian's entrepreneurial spirit is actually an addiction to spending money we don't have. I found a hidden credit line for $30,000 last week. He says it's for a client project, but the charges are for high-end watches and hotel suites. I love him, but I need Maya to be safe. I've hidden a secondary insurance policy in my name, with you as the executor. Do not let Julian know. He sees money as a scoreboard, I see it as a shield for our daughter." Beneath the note was the policy number. The payout was $250,000. My blood turned to ice. Julian had been complaining about being broke for 30 months, all while he had likely already found a way to siphon off the primary life insurance. He was playing a part, wearing the tired father mask to keep me funding his secret Cayman exit while Maya wore shoes held together by glue. I called my contact at the insurance company, a man who owed me a favor from a corporate audit I'd performed 2 years ago. "I need to know if policy number 8842 has been touched," I said, my voice like sharpened steel. "1 second, Elias," he muttered, the sound of keys tapping in the background. "Here it is. It's a $250,000 term policy. The claim was filed 6 weeks after Clara Thorne's death. The payout went to a trust account." "Who is the trustee?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Julian Vane. He filed it as the natural guardian of Maya Vane." "But Elias, the money is gone. The account balance is 0. Julian hadn't just taken my $105,000. He had stolen his own daughter's $250,000 inheritance to build his new life. He was a predator who had spent 3 years treating his sister's death like a lottery win." I sat in my car, staring at the sage-green front door of the house Clara had built. Julian was inside, probably checking his Vane account, waiting for my next transfer. "The math is complete, Julian," I said to the empty car. "Now, it's time for the audit." The revelation of the missing $250,000 changed the geometry of my anger. It was no longer just about the $105,000 I had bled out in monthly wires, it was about a systematic theft of Maya's future. Julian hadn't just managed his grief, he had liquidated it. I drove back to the glass and steel house the following afternoon. I knew Julian was at a networking lunch in the city, likely more eggs Benedict paid for with my Saturday overtime. I found his mother, Sylvia, in the garden, pruning roses with a hollow look in her eyes that I now recognized as bone-deep exhaustion. "Elias, you're back early," she said, her voice thin. She didn't look at me, she looked at the dirt. Sylvia, we need to talk about the New Life folder, I said, keeping my voice as calm as a professional audit. She froze. The garden shears clattered onto the stone path. Maya shouldn't have told you that. Julian said it was a surprise. The only surprise, Sylvia, is that Julian thinks a forensic accountant won't find a paper trail to the Cayman Islands, I replied, stepping closer. I know about Vane Designs. I know about the $250,000 insurance policy he emptied. And I know he's waiting for my next $3,500 to hit the seed account so he can book a one-way flight. Sylvia collapsed onto a stone bench, her face breaking into a map of wrinkles and regret. He told me he was protecting her, Elias. He said the family here was toxic, and that Clara wanted them to have a fresh start away from the memories. By letting her wear shoes with holes in them? I countered, my voice sharpening. By skipping her dental checkups while he buys $400 watches? You've been the cleanup crew, Sylvia. You tidy the house before I visit, you keep Maya quiet on the phone, and you help him play the part of the grieving widower. I was afraid, she whispered, finally looking up with wet eyes. He told me if I said anything to you, I'd never see Maya again. He said he'd take her so far away I'd die before I found them. This was the shattered ego of a man who used his own mother as a shield. Julian wasn't a mastermind, he was a bully with a spreadsheet. But Sylvia's fear was the final piece of evidence I needed. I'm not here to punish you, Sylvia, I said, sitting beside her. But I am going to stop him. I need you to tell me exactly when he plans to move the final seed money. He needs a cleared transfer to reach that $120,000 milestone for the Cayman project, doesn't he? She nodded slowly. The 1st of next month. He says once your wire clears, he's closing the local accounts and leaving that night. He already has the bags packed in the attic. I felt a cold surge of certainty. I had 10 days. I left the house and went straight to a small, private law firm, Holloway & Finch. My attorney, Marcus, was a man who specialized in asset recovery for the victims of white-collar crime. I laid out the binder I had built, the 30 months of transfers, the Vane Shell Company records, and Clara's handwritten, just-in-case, note. Marcus looked at the Bria column, which I had renamed the Maya column, and saw the same $0 spending on healthcare and education that had fueled my rage. This is classic financial exploitation of an estate, Marcus said, tapping his pen against the desk. But if we move now, he'll flee. We need him to think the seed is still growing. The lawyer in the Virginia case gave the same advice, I noted, remembering the arithmetic strategy. I have to send the next $3,500. I have to let him think he's won. Exactly, Marcus agreed. We file an emergency, ex parte, injunction on the morning of the 1st. We freeze the Vane account the second your money hits it. Then, we invite him to a family estate meeting, here in this office. We let the math do the screaming. I walked out of the office and went home to my rice and lentils. My emergency fund was gone, spent on the legal retainer. My apartment felt smaller than ever. But as I looked at the photo of Clara on my desk, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a predator who had just finished building a cage. The 10 days leading up to the final transfer were a study in professional acting. Every time my phone buzzed with a text from Julian, usually a gentle reminder about the upcoming wire, I felt a surge of adrenaline that I had to mask with a calm, academic tone. I was no longer Elias the grieving brother, I was Elias the auditor, and in an audit, you never reveal your findings until the final report is signed. To keep Julian from suspecting the crack in the wall, I invited him to a sympathy dinner at a mid-range steakhouse on Friday night. I watched him sit across from me, wearing a $600 tailored jacket that I knew, with mathematical certainty, was paid for by my Saturday overtime shifts at the firm. I really appreciate this, Elias, Julian said, cutting into a prime rib that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. It's been so hard lately. Maya's school fees just went up, and I've been struggling to keep the family fund above water. That transfer on the 1st, it's literally the only thing keeping us in that house. I took a sip of water, looking him dead in the eye. I thought about the split shoes in the kitchen. I thought about the empty, green column in his bank records. I know, Julian. Stability is everything for a child. I'm just glad I can help secure her future. The irony was thick enough to choke on. He thought he was securing her future by moving her to a tax haven where he could spend her inheritance in peace. I was securing it by preparing to dismantle his entire existence. While Julian was busy performing The Grieving Father for an audience of one, I was working the phones with Marcus at Holloway and Finch. We weren't just looking at local accounts. I used my professional network to contact a compliance officer at a partner firm in the Cayman Islands. I need a red flag inquiry on Aura Vane designs, I told my contact, my voice a low hum in my darkened studio. It's a shell for a $120,000 buy-in on the Crystal Cove project. I have documented evidence that the capital is derived from stolen insurance proceeds and fraudulent personal transfers. The response came back on Monday morning. The Cayman project had already flagged the Aura Vane account because the initial deposit had come from a trust account that lacked the proper secondary signatures. Julian's greed had made him sloppy. He had forged the trustee authorization, thinking no one would audit a dead woman's minor policy. They're ready to freeze the investment the moment we file the injunction here, Marcus told me, his voice sounding like sharpened steel. But remember, the wire must clear. If he doesn't see that $3,500 hit his account on the 1st, he'll pull the trigger on those plane tickets before the sheriff can serve the papers. On the night of the 31st, I sat at my desk and authorized the 31st wire transfer. $3,500. It felt like feeding a beast to lead it into a trap. I watched the processing wheel spin on my banking app. In my mind, I could see the spreadsheet I had built for the Vane liquidation. Protagonist sacrifice, 31 months of rice, lentils, and 0 vacations. Antagonist theft, $105,000 in wires plus $250,000 in stolen inheritance. The final balance, $0 for Maya. $120,000 for Julian's ego. I hit confirm. The money left my account at 12:01 a.m. on the 1st. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the clock tick toward 10 a.m., the time set for the family estate meeting at Marcus's office. Julian had texted me at 7:45 a.m., transfer received. You're a lifesaver, Elias. See you at the lawyer's office to sign those boring documents you mentioned. Maya says hi. He thought he was coming in to sign a routine probate waiver I had invented to lure him in. He thought he'd be out by noon, picking up Maya, and heading to the airport with a $120,000 seed in his pocket. He didn't know that the boring documents waiting on Marcus's desk weren't waivers. They were the arithmetic of his destruction. The conference room at Holloway and Finch was a sterile box of glass and polished wood that felt like a surgical theater. Marcus sat to my left, his hands resting on a black leather binder that contained 31 months of Julian's double life. I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow, watching the door. I had spent 930 days being the quiet accountant. Today, the quiet was over. Julian walked in at 10:05 a.m., radiating the casual confidence of a man who already had his bags packed. He was wearing the $600 jacket again, a gold watch glinting on his wrist, the very watch Clara's hidden note had warned me about. His mother, Sylvia, followed behind him, her eyes red and fixed on the floor. "Sorry we're late, Elias," Julian said, pulling out a chair with a flourish. "Let's get these waivers signed. I've got a busy afternoon ahead of me, lots of errands for Maya." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't offer water. He simply opened the binder. "We aren't here for waivers, Julian," Marcus said, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "We are here for an audit." Julian laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "An audit? For what? The pennies Elias sends me? Look, if this is about the family fund." "It's about the arithmetic, Julian," I interrupted, leaning forward. "Math doesn't get emotional. It doesn't care about your grief or your branding agency. It only cares about the paper trail." Marcus began fanning documents across the table like a dealer at a high-stakes poker game. First, the 31 wire transfer receipts from my account, totaling $108,500. Every dollar was meant for Maya's care, Marcus stated. Second, the Aura Vane Designs bank statements from Delaware. Marcus had highlighted them in two colors, yellow for Julian's lifestyle, luxury dining, high-end apparel, and the $1,200 monthly lease on a car Clara never drove. Green for Maya's expenses. The green column was a desert. $0 for new shoes. $0 for the dentist. $0 for the private school tuition he claimed was drowning him. Julian's smirk began to flicker. You can't just go through my private business accounts. That's legal discovery, Julian, I said, my voice rising just enough to cut him off. But we're not done. Third, Marcus placed the $250,000 life insurance claim on the table, alongside a bank record showing a $0 balance. You emptied your daughter's inheritance in 18 months, Julian, Marcus said. And you moved it to a fix-and-flip project in the Cayman Islands. The silence in the room became heavy, the kind of silence that happens right before a building collapses. Julian's hands, which had been resting casually on the table, were now clenched into white-knuckled fists. And finally, I said, placing the most important document in the center of the table, Clara's just-in-case folder. My sister knew who you were, Julian. She knew you were weak with money. She didn't leave you in charge of Maya's future. She left me. I watched the shattered ego take place in real time. Julian's face went from indignant to pale, then to a terrifying, empty gray. He looked at his mother, but Sylvia didn't look back. She was staring at the photo of the splitting shoes Marcus had placed next to the Cayman investment records. This is a lie, Julian whispered, but there was no conviction in it. I was building a life for her. You were building an exit for yourself, Marcus countered. We filed an emergency injunction at 9 a.m. this morning. The Vane account is frozen. The Cayman project has been notified of the fraud. You aren't going anywhere, Julian. Julian looked at the door, then back at the mountain of evidence. The mastermind was gone. In his place was a man who realized that the seed he had been growing with my sacrifice was nothing but ash. So, I said, tapping the $108,500 in receipts. Are we going to discuss the voluntary transfer of custody, or should I call the district attorney for wire fraud? The air in the conference room felt thin, as if the mountain of documents on the table had sucked the oxygen out of the space. Julian stared at the $108,500 in wire transfer receipts, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. The shattered ego was complete. The man who had spent 3 years mocking my boring life as an accountant was now being systematically dismantled by the very spreadsheets he despised. You think you've won? Julian finally hissed, his voice trembling with a desperate, jagged edge. You can't prove I didn't spend that money on her. I'm the father. The law is on my side. Marcus leaned back, clicking his pen with a sound that felt like a gavel. The law is on the side of the truth, Julian. And the truth is sitting in a manila folder in the hall. Marcus signaled to his assistant, who opened the door and handed him a final, 3-page document. This, Marcus said, sliding it toward Julian, is a signed, notarized witness statement from Sylvia Vane. Julian's head whipped around to look at his mother. Sylvia didn't flinch this time. She sat straight, her hands folded over her purse, looking at a spot on the wall behind me. She has documented every time you left Maya alone to go to the city, Marcus continued. She has documented the New Life folder. She has documented your threats to take Maya away if she ever spoke to Elias. In the eyes of the court, you aren't just a negligent parent, you are a flight risk who has actively siphoned a minor's inheritance into offshore accounts. Julian reached for the statement, but his hands were shaking so violently he couldn't even pick up the paper. The mastermind had run out of moves. Here is the deal, Julian, I said, my voice low and steady, the tone I use when I'm explaining a fatal error in a client's audit. You are going to sign a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights to me. You are going to sign over the deed to the house my sister designed and paid for, into a trust for Maya, with me as the sole trustee. That's my house. Julian erupted, slamming his fist on the table. Actually, I countered, sliding a property record across the table, it's a house with a mortgage that has been paid for the last 30 months by my seed money. I have the tracing logs to prove it. In a civil suit, I'd take the house anyway. In a criminal suit, you'd be watching the house from a prison cell. Julian looked at his lawyer, a man he'd clearly hired for his lack of questions, but even that man was looking at the floor, making no move to defend him. The math was too clean. The paper trail was too deep. If you sign now, Marcus added, Elias will agree not to file the criminal fraud referral with the district attorney. You walk away with your freedom and whatever is in your personal checking account. You don't sign? We call the sheriff in 5 minutes. Julian looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him truly see me. He didn't see the quiet brother who ate lentils and worked overtime. He saw the man who had been calculating his downfall since the moment I saw Maya's split shoes. He picked up the pen. He signed the custody transfer first, the scratch of the nib on the paper the only sound in the room. Then he signed the deed transfer. He didn't look at Sylvia. He didn't look at the photo of Maya. When he finished, he stood up, his expensive jacket now looking like a costume that didn't fit. He walked out of the room without a word, the mastermind leaving behind nothing but a stack of yellow and green evidence. I sat in the silence, staring at the signature that meant Maya was finally safe. I didn't feel the rush of victory I expected. I just felt like I could finally breathe. Elias, Sylvia said softly, standing up to follow her son out. I'm sorry I waited so long. Just be there when she wakes up from her nap, Sylvia, I said. That's all that matters now. The glass and steel house felt different as I pulled into the driveway that evening. For 3 years, this place had been a monument to Clara's talent and Julian's parasitism. Now, it was just a house again. The shattered ego of the Vane name had been scrubbed from the deed, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest paying for my own seat at the table. Julian was gone. He had slunk out of the lawyer's office and back to the house only long enough to throw his designer suits into a duffel bag and disappear before the locks were changed. Sylvia was in the kitchen, quietly making a sandwich for Maya, who was sitting on the floor in the living room, surrounded by her books, the books Julian had told her she couldn't take to her new life. Uncle Elias. Maya shouted, running toward me. She was wearing a pair of clean, brand-new sneakers I had stopped to buy on the way over. The $45 price tag had felt like the best investment I'd ever made. I hugged her, the weight of the last 30 months finally beginning to lift. Hey, kiddo. How do the new shoes feel? They don't make the clicky sound anymore, she said, beaming. And they don't fall off when I run. I spent the next several hours in Clara's home office, a room Julian had used as a backdrop for his branding videos. I began clearing out his remnants, the empty expensive cologne bottles, the framed self-portraits, and the seed folder I had found in the garage. But as I pulled a stack of old architectural magazines from the bottom shelf of Clara's desk, I noticed a discrepancy in the depth of the cabinet. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to notice when things don't add up, even in physical space. I pulled the drawer out entirely and reached into the dark gap behind the frame. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. It was a small, magnetic key box. Inside was a single, brass safe deposit key and a folded note in Clara's unmistakable, slanted handwriting. Elias, I know you're the only one who will ever find this. Julian looks at the surface of things, you look at the structure. This key belongs to box 412 at the First National on Main. It's not money. Julian would have spent money. It's the one thing he couldn't liquidate because he never understood its value. It's the blueprints for the future. Please, make sure she builds it. The next morning, I stood in the vault of the First National. My hands were steady as I turned the key. I expected more insurance papers or perhaps the title to a hidden asset. Instead, I found a roll of heavy drafting paper and a digital drive. I unrolled the paper on the viewing table. It wasn't a skyscraper or a luxury condo. It was a complete set of blueprints for a mid-sized vocational center, a school for young women in architecture and engineering. Clara had designed the entire project in secret, titled the Sterling Vision Institute. I plugged the digital drive into my laptop. The drive contained a video message and a ledger. I hit play, and Clara's face filled the screen, looking vibrant and sharp, just as I remembered her. Elias, if you're seeing this, it means Julian's greed finally hit the ceiling, she said, her voice echoing in the small vault. I didn't just save for Maya's childhood. I saved for her impact. The ledger on this drive is a private investment portfolio I started when she was born. It's separate from the life insurance. It's tied to the patents for the sustainable glass I developed. Julian never knew about the royalties because he never bothered to read my contracts. He only looked at the bank balance. I opened the ledger. My eyes widened. The royalty payments had been accumulating for 7 years, untouched and unnoticed. The total balance was $1.8 million. Julian had spent 30 months trying to steal $120,000 for a new life in the Caymans. He had broken his daughter's heart and siphoned her aunt's savings for a seed that was essentially pocket change compared to the forest Clara had grown in the shadows. He was looking at the pennies. "Clara," I whispered to the screen, a jagged laugh escaping my throat. And he missed the empire. The math was finally complete. The Vane liquidation wasn't just about stopping a thief. It was about revealing a legacy that Julian was never worthy of seeing. I walked out of the bank with the blueprints under my arm. The autumn air felt crisp and clean. I had one more call to make. "Marcus," I said when my lawyer picked up. "We don't just need to protect the house. We need to set up a foundation. We're building something. And Julian Vane is going to watch every brick go up from the bottom of the pit he dug for himself." The fluorescent lights of the county visitor center hummed with a sterile, unforgiving vibration. On the other side of the reinforced glass, Julian looked like a man who had finally been hollowed out. The expensive silk suit was gone, replaced by a drab gray sweatshirt that seemed to sag on his shoulders. His certainty, the arrogance that had been his armor for 30 months, had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the raw, trembling nerves of a man who realized he had been the architect of his own ruin. "You look different, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the small chamber. He didn't look up. His hands, once used to dismiss my sister's memory with a wave, were locked in a tight, white-knuckled grip on the table. I saw the bank logs, Elias. The lawyers showed them to me. Clara didn't just track the stocks. She tracked me. She was an architect, Julian, I reminded him quietly. She understood that if a system is failing, you don't just look at the building. You look at the person running it. She watched you drain those credit lines for years. She didn't stop you because she wanted to see if you had a bottom. You didn't. Julian finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a frantic, desperate hatred. She set me up. She sat there at every dinner, every holiday, letting me talk, letting me think I was winning, while she was documenting my every move. That's not a wife, Elias. That's a predator. No, I said, leaning closer to the glass. That's a mirror. She didn't make you steal that money. She didn't make you cook the books at your agency. She just provided the resources and waited to see who you actually were. You unmasked yourself, Julian. She just made sure there was a record of it. I pushed a single piece of paper against the glass, a copy of the first scholarship grant from the Sterling Vision Institute. The Cayman project collapsed, Julian, I said. Your $120,000 seed was seized as proceeds of crime. But the institute, it's already built. We're using your restitution payments, the ones taken directly from your new HVAC wages, to fund the drafting supplies for girls in Maya's grade. Julian let out a bitter, jagged laugh. Restitution? I'm working for pennies while you play at Legacy? The money isn't the point, Julian. It never was. That's why you lost. I stood up to leave. The guard stepped forward, but I paused for one last word. Clara left a final entry in her private ledger. It said, Julian has the fire, but Elias has the eyes. One will burn the house down trying to stay warm, the other will rebuild it from the ashes. You proved her right. Enjoy the heat. As I walked out of the facility, the crisp autumn air hit me with a sense of profound relief. The legal battle was over. Julian had accepted a plea deal, 5 years for wire fraud and embezzlement. His mother, Sylvia, was finally at peace, living in the guest house and helping Maya with her sketches. I drove back to the glass and steel house. I walked into Clara's old office, now my study, and sat at her desk. I picked up the brass safe deposit key that had started the final audit. I realized then that the $1.8 million, which was already growing with the new glass patents, wasn't the true inheritance. The money was just the fuel. The real gift was the clarity. Clara had given me the permission to be exactly who I was, a man who looks beneath the surface, who values data over status, and who understands that the loudest voice in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. I opened my laptop and looked at the screen. The Institute's bank account was holding steady, a silent fortune built on years of patience. I hit a key, authorizing the final transfer for Maya's college trust, funded entirely by the dividends Julian had never bothered to find. The shattered ego of our family was finally healed, not by wealth, but by the truth. Julian had been wrong. He thought he was the mastermind, but the quiet man with the spreadsheets had been the only one who truly understood the cost of a lie. I looked at the framed certificate of the Sterling Vision Institute hanging on the wall. I smiled, a quiet, certain smile. The math finally adds up, Clara, I whispered to the empty room. And for the first time, we don't owe anyone a single cent. I closed the laptop, turned off the lights, and walked out into the twilight, leaving the ghosts behind. For the first time in 3 years, the Thorn name didn't stand for a sacrifice. It stood for the truth. And in the end, that was the only currency that mattered.